I'm Dana Searles, and welcome to This Week in Iowa Politics on We Are Iowa Plus. This past week, Iowa Democrats lost its first-in-the-nation caucus status, with the Democratic National Committee selecting South Carolina to go first instead. We're breaking down with a political expert what this means going forward. Also, the Food Bank of Iowa released a new study showing the growing rates of food insecurity in our state. We'll dive into some of those numbers. But first, we start on the campaign trail, talking about a major endorsement made this week. Democrat Josh Turek picked up an endorsement from former President Barack Obama. The announcement came in a video. This video you see on your screen right here of the two playing basketball. Now, Turek is running for a closely watched Senate seat that is currently open, with Republican Senator Joni Ernst not running for re-election. Turek is running against Republican U.S. Representative Ashley Hinson. Hinson has been endorsed by President Trump. Now, the Hinson campaign offered a response to Obama's endorsement of Turek. Her team says, quote, "Another liberal endorses Josh Turek. Shocking," end quote. Also this week, we're getting finance reports in the race for the open U.S. Senate seat. Right now, Hinson holds more cash on hand than Turek. However, Turek out-fundraised Hinson in the latest filing period. Reports show Hinson is with about $6.7 million cash on hand, while Turek has just around $2.3 million. However, in the latest filing, the period after the primaries up until June 30th, Turek out-fundraised Hinson. It was a close margin, though. Turek raised about $2.8 million, while Hinson raised $2 million. Also this week, in a major shakeup, Iowa Democrats have lost its first-in-the-nation caucus status. Holding the first spot made Iowa the first state in the country to hold official voting for the presidential elections. The Democratic National Committee instead chose South Carolina to go first. Local 5 spoke with Iowa State University political expert Karen Kedrowski about what influenced this decision. She says it's influenced by multiple reasons. One is that Iowa had technical problems leading to delayed caucus results in 2020, and another might have to do with valuing black voters, as the black population in South Carolina is much higher than in Iowa. Both Iowa Democrats and Republicans are unhappy about the move away from Iowa.
Iowa is the center of the political universe right now. We have multiple targeted races, strong candidates who are running winning campaigns, and a robust statewide organizing network.
Am I irritated with this? You better believe it. My state has been disrespected.
And Iowa Democrats have an interesting decision to make now, because it is state law for Iowa to have the first caucus in the nation.
The Democratic Party in Iowa has some difficult choices to make. Do they defy the national party, or do they and comply with state law, or do they try to get around the state law in some way?
The DNC has selected Nevada to follow South Carolina, then New Hampshire, New Mexico, Michigan, and Virginia. The final vote to set this order in place will take place next month. And this development is something that can really have a lot of impacts going forward. So this week, I spoke with Iowa State University professor Kelly Winfrey, who specializes in campaign communications, about the impacts of this and what exactly it looks like for Iowa Democrats going forward in the election cycle. Iowa Democrats lost their first-in-the-nation caucus status, with Democrats choosing South Carolina to now go first instead. So joining me now to break down more of the impacts of this is Iowa State University professor Kelly Winfrey. Kelly, you've joined us a handful of times, so thanks for being back on with us. Really appreciate it. Want to ask you just about a couple of questions, overall impacts about this. I guess start by just telling me a little bit about the biggest reasons that Iowa Democrats lost its first position.
I think it's been something that's been talked about for a while, is that Iowa is, not by surprise to anyone, not the most demographically diverse state. And so having Iowa start for some felt like we weren't, we as in Iowa weren't representative of the country or of potential Democratic voters. And then the other kind of factor that's been there for a while is the accessibility of caucusing for individuals. Taking time out of your evening to go physically sit someplace for a couple hours can be challenging for some folks who work during those hours, need childcare. And so those things have been talked about for several years. And I think the other big thing that we've come to with this cycle, and we can dive into more of how this has unfolded, but 2020 did not go smoothly for the Iowa caucuses for Democrats in terms of counting and reporting results. And then the other piece is that Iowa's been pretty reliably red for statewide or congressional elections for the past decade or so. So it's not as Democratic, so maybe not as good of a test for who the Democratic nominee should be. Now, Iowans would argue that that's exactly who they should be appealing to, are Midwestern rural voters who maybe haven't been voting Democratic that could be won over. But that's, I think, why the DNC ultimately decided to start with states like South Carolina and Nevada that have more racial diversity, especially.
And obviously, the Democratic National Committee still needs to vote to officialize this. But I guess now that this has happened and this is the decision, as we look ahead to the upcoming elections for Iowa Democrats, I know you specialize in campaign messaging. What does this mean? What's the impacts that this has for Iowa Democrats in these midterm elections?
Well, I think it could signal to some folks that the national party doesn't prioritize Iowa. But I don't think that the average general election voter is paying that much heed to what the national parties are saying. We've already seen some of the Democratic candidates talk a little bit about the decision and, holding off that conversation until after this election. The big issue is support from the national parties, from the Congressional Committee, Senate Congressional Committee, or Campaign Committee, in support for the Democratic candidates in Iowa. So particularly our governor's race, the Senate race, as well as at least 2 or maybe 3 of the U.S. House races are pretty contentious and could be pickups for Democrats that both those candidates, the state party, want to see be successful and have some of that money from the national party. And I think also the national party needs to have enough support for those candidates to potentially win back the House, maybe the Senate, but Iowa's a key factor in that. I think it makes sense that I don't think any of the candidates have said too much that's too awful about going rogue or anything like that, because they need to stay in good graces with the national party. But I imagine there'll be a little bit more back and forth after the election. And I think if Democrats do well in Iowa in November, then they can make a better case for why Iowa should be early in the calendar for the Democratic primaries.
And that leads into my next question, is just how do Democrats, specifically Iowa Democrats, move forward from this when it comes to rebuilding that statewide political strength?
I think it's the same issue that the national party is struggling with and state parties around the country is what is the identity of the Democratic Party, particularly what is the identity of the Democratic Party that's not a we are not Trump or we are not MAGA sort of identity. And that is a challenge at the national level. And if we look at primaries around the country, there's been several that Democratic leadership, like Chuck Schumer, have endorsed early candidates in primaries to support certain more moderate Democrats, more mainstream Democrats. And that sort of interference in those state primaries is often not received well, but it's also an attempt by the national party to kind of unify a message. And the national party has to figure out what is their message for what the party represents. And our local Iowa Democrats have to do the same thing. And I think the biggest challenge for Democrats is that there's a broader spectrum of political ideology from more liberal to conservative, particularly if you look issue by issue, than there might be with some Republican voters. So Republicans have been very successful for decades in having a strong, unified message that really unites most of their candidates. Democrats have historically been the big tent party, appealing to lots of different voters and different interests. But that gets challenging when I think particularly Republicans have been successful at characterizing Democrats by some of the most extreme candidates, when that might not, be the case for Iowa Democrats. So it's an identity crisis. And I think Republicans are going through similar issues, as well as what will their party look like post-Trump or post-MAGA. But it's about figuring out who they are and communicating that to their audiences. And that includes both general election voters, as well as those who already align with the party or those who they could potentially bring in to align with the party.
Coming up, my interview with Kelly continues. We talk more about how this decision will impact campaigns for Iowa Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections. Up next, I talk with Kelly Winfrey, Iowa State University professor, more about the impacts of Iowa Democrats losing its first-in-the-nation caucus status and what that could have on campaign communications for the midterm elections. Also, we talk about if Iowa Democrats could ever regain its spot back. Here's the second part of our interview. And since we are just a few months away from those midterms, from a communications perspective, from the campaign's perspective, do you think this is a topic, those Democratic candidates try to shy away from, or is it something you think that they maybe will take and try to unite the party around?
I think it's an opportunity for them to try to unite the party, and particularly within the state, to come together to make the case for why Iowa matters on a national sense, because that can tie in nicely to what each of those candidates will do if they were to win their office. So Rob Sam can talk about Iowa's place in the national conversation, in the in the U.S. economy. When you look at the Senate candidates, or the Senate candidate and House candidates, those Democrats can talk about what it would mean to be a Democrat from Iowa, going to D.C. and advocating on behalf of Iowa. So it's an opportunity, given the strength of some of the candidates and how close some of these races are. It's an opportunity for Democrats to try to figure out what their identity is in Iowa anyway, which I think then might give them a better shot at convincing a national audience or the national party that they, are relevant to the conversation and can give insights into who would be a good presidential candidate for the Democrats.
Do you think, I guess this is going to be a pretty bare bones question, do you see Iowa Democrats regaining that first-in-the-nation status again? And if so, how quickly do you think they can do it? Will this take time? Will this take years? Or could they do it, next election cycle?
I think it's probably done for the next election cycle. But you never know. And I think what happens in November, if there's a big blue wave, if Iowa starts to swing blue, maybe things get reconsidered. That also would be, what happens in some of the other states that are earlier in the counter and in the calendar, and what Democrats are successful in those places or not. But I think that in order to be at the top of the calendar, we have to be able to make a case for both parties about why Iowa is a good test for a national candidacy. And really, I would point to 2020 as why Iowa actually, was a good test, because the way people campaign in Iowa for caucuses, there's a lot of one-on-one communication, a lot of kind of candidate image building to say here's who I am as a person, and in a very authentic, usually more small group sort of way. So you get a different type of read of the candidates than you do on a debate stage or in an advertisement. And in 2020, for those, maybe people forgot, Joe Biden did not do well in the Iowa primary in 2020. And it was my feeling in watching him in a lot of campaigns that he was not as, cognitively quick as he had once been, or as some of the other candidates were. And had COVID not happened, had there been a more traditional campaign with a traditional 3 debates, had those circumstances been different, that version of Biden might have been seen in 2020, and he might not have been successful. But what Iowa voters did tell the Democrats, and I think this holds true, is that the party was swinging in some different directions with Pete Buttigieg, a younger candidate. He didn't have as much experience, but he was smart and communicated well. Bernie Sanders did well. Some more further left ideologies had some potential. So I think looking backwards can help inform what we need to do forward. I think what Iowa Democrats can't do is just say, we should keep doing what we're doing because we like it. That's not a good argument for going first. They need to have a good argument for why they matter, and why Democrats in Iowa matter enough to influence the party's candidate on a national sense disproportionately to other states.
All right, well, all very good points. Kelly, I'm sure we could talk about this for a while, and there's still a lot to track, but we'll wrap that up for now. But as always, we really appreciate your expertise on these topics.
Thank you.
Coming up, the Food Bank of Iowa released a new study showing that food insecurity in our state is on the rise. We'll break down the numbers and what county is most impacted. Central Iowa Water Works has lifted all mandatory and voluntary water use restrictions. The decision comes this week after it shut off the nitrate removal facility. Now, nitrate levels dropped below federal drinking water standards, allowing the facility to shut down and ease its water restrictions. Now, while restrictions have ended, CIWW still encourages customers to conserve water. They recommend following an even odd lawn watering schedule, watering landscapes only when necessary, and continuing to use water wisely indoors. Also this week, Central Iowa Water Works says its nitrate removal facility is no longer running. CIWW says it turned it off back on July 23rd, and the facility has run for a record amount of days this year. It ran for 193 days in 2026. The previous record was 177 days in 2015. A new survey out this week shows a string of challenges that the Food Bank of Iowa says it has seen lately. According to Feeding America's annual Map the Meal Gap study, more than 402,000 Iowans experience food insecurity. That is 1 in 8 Iowans and 1 in 6 Iowa kids. Crawford County in western Iowa has the highest rate of food insecurity, with 17% of its population food insecure. In Polk County, the overall rate of food insecurity is 12%. Other top counties impacted include Appanoose County, where 16.7% of the population is food insecure, and Wapello County, where 16.1% of its residents are impacted. The food bank says the need is only growing as wages fail to catch up with rising gas and food prices, and this study helps show that growing need.
It really helps us to tell our story and deploy the resources where they are used the best. And so this, even though it's based on 2024 data, there has been a lot of change. There's been continuous rise. And so it really underscores what we already know, but it also does help us determine the best way to deploy our resources.
The Food Bank of Iowa says the need has grown so much in the past 7 years that the nonprofit now spends more per month on food alone right now than they did in the entire year of 2019. Well, another very busy week in Iowa politics, so let's look ahead to what we're tracking next week. The city of Des Moines is closing its budget cut feedback survey. We'll follow up with the city to see if there are any results reportable yet. We'll also continue, as always, to track your top political headlines. We'll have that and much more next week on This Week in Iowa Politics. Thank you all for watching on We Are Iowa Plus. I'm Dana Searles. Have a great day.